I am delighted and honoured to introduce Thom van Dooren as the recipient of this year's BBVA Biophilia Award. His work has expanded our conception of what biophilia means. He has made an outstanding contribution to both academic understanding and public understanding of the environmental humanities and the methods and implications of that newly emerging discipline. Van Dooren has done this by writing with narrative wit, urgency, clarity, and good humour. He tells fascinating, gripping, revealing stories that merge, or, to use one of his favourite words, entangle human and non-human life. Thom van Dooren is Professor of Environmental Humanities in the School of Humanities and the Sydney Environment Institute at the University of Sydney, Australia. From 2024, he has also been a Humboldt Research Award-funded fellow at the Multidisciplinary Environmental Studies in the Humanities Mesh Research Hub at the University of Cologne, Germany. He holds a PhD from the Australian National University, and from 2011 to 2017, he helped found and then worked with the Environmental Humanities Group at the University of New South Wales, home to Australia's and one of the world's first undergraduate degrees in the environmental humanities, before he moved to the University of Sydney in 2018. Thom is the author of 3 of the past decade's most highly cited books in the environmental humanities: Flightways, Life and Loss at the Edge of Extinction, Columbia University Press, 2014. The Wake of Crows, Living and Dying in Shared Worlds, Columbia University Press, 2019. And A World in a Shell, Snail Stories for a Time of Extinctions, MIT Press, 2022. These 3 titles have been translated into French, and some are available in Japanese, Italian, and Chinese. He is one of the first scholars to bring into ecological studies and animal studies, and especially extinction studies, a fundamental insight from post-structuralist theory. The insight is that entities are always discursive. In Martin Heidegger's term, always already discursive. This means that individuals, human and non-human, are always in the process of being formed by the networks of relations, material and cultural, in which they live. There is no state of existence prior to this embeddedness in mutually formative relations. No identity that is pre-discursive. This perception was always implicit in scientific ecology when it was a newly emerging discipline early in the 20th century. Ecology emerged as an alternative to the practice of isolating captive specimens for laboratory study, primarily anatomical study. Ecology, as a new method, did not separate creatures from the environments in which they lived. The term ecosystem was invented by A.G. Tansley in 1935. Instead, ecology studied relations of interdependency in those ecosystems, ways in which a system continually produces and modifies the creature, which in turn produces and modifies the environment. This shift of emphasis towards co-evolution can be seen as a precursor of the post-structuralist account of the formation and continuous reformation of human identity, both individual identity and communal cultural identity. This was the essence of Jacques Derrida's post-Heideggerian rejection of what he called the metaphysics of presence. That is, the idea that meaning, as mediated by language, could ever be pre-discursive and therefore fixed. This was a foundational move for post-structuralist theory in the humanities. And in recent years, the environmental humanities have taken shape, attempting to bring together the insights and methods of various disciplines: scientific ecology, the aims and priorities of the environmental and conservation movements, and the explorations of human experience carried out and expressed by the arts and humanities, including philosophy, history, literary criticism, and all the creative arts. Theorists in the environmental humanities, such as Karen Barad and Timothy Morton, have observed that the concept of discursiveness has always had a parallel in scientific ecology. In post-structuralist theory, discursiveness was identified primarily as a property of human culture and psychology. In ecology, discursiveness is a property of the natural material world. Environmental humanities scholars recognize this parallel when they use the term material-discursive. This is a concept fundamental to the definition of the environmental humanities, and Thom van Dooren has done perhaps more than any other practicing scholar in the ecological humanities to convert that theoretical principle into practical method and human narrative. And thus, he has brought about a newly expansive public understanding of what ecology means and what its implications are for human as well as non-human life. He thus remarkably builds several bridges. Abstract academic theory is not frequently in the humanities converted into living human practice. It tends to remain primarily theoretical. But Van Dooren makes an exception. He gives us discursiveness as both an observed feature of nature and an academic practice. Another bridge he builds is between academic and public understanding, and yet another is between the individual self, our sense of who we are as individuals, and the larger ecological networks, human and non-human, in which we are embedded. Van Dooren builds these bridges by writing accessibly, in a way that carries a non-specialist audience with him, or for that matter, the rather narrowly specialist audience that might come from the sciences or the humanities. He carries these audiences on a journey that starts with a particular animal species in danger of extinction and moves into a more and more expansive pattern of often unexpected entanglements of the non-human with the human, and indeed entanglements of different, usually separate parts of human communities, such as in Hawaii, the indigenous spiritual communities, the scientists and conservationists, and the United States military, all of whom are involved with the habits of the endangered snails. And thus, these different communities have been brought into dialogue with each other by the unwitting agency of those snails. Van Dooren says that this understanding of extinction is grounded in an attentiveness to entanglements. When species are understood as vast intergenerational lineages, interwoven in rich patterns of co-becoming with others, then their departure from the world cannot help but be felt in a range of complex and drawn-out ways. Extinction, he says, is never a sharp, singular event, something that begins rapidly, takes place, and then is over and done with. Rather, the edge of extinction is more often a dull one, a slow unraveling of intimately entangled ways of life that begins long before the death of the last individual and continues to ripple forward. With exceptional clarity, thoroughness, and liveliness, Van Dooren's work reveals this unraveling to a public that might not otherwise see the connections. An extinction, in his view, does not merely occur with the death of the endling, the last surviving specimen, such as the Hawaiian snail called George, alone in its plastic container, so memorably described in A World in a Shell. No, an extinction is the loss of a whole network of life, the social life of that species, which tells each individual who they are, and all the effects of that species on its ecosystem, and all its relations with other species. Van Dooren is superb at showing us how this network extends steadily outwards. He thus shows us complex patterns in our own lives and moves beyond the merely regretful elegiac treatment of extinctions or imminent extinctions. For example, the collapse of the vulture populations in India has consequences for the keeping of cattle, so fundamental to rural human livelihoods and traditional Hindu culture. Other consequences include an increase in the population of feral dogs, and therefore in the rates of rabies infection in humans. There are also implications for the disposal of human corpses, and questions are raised about attitudes and practices in different cultures concerning the decay of the body, its reabsorption into the larger energy flow. Vultures, says Van Dooren, remind us that death must be thought of not as a simple ending, but as completely central to the ongoing life of multi-species communities in which we are all ultimately food for one another. His work conveys this recontextualizing perspective with great eloquence. And he also shows us that what we lose, what the world loses with an extinction, is a unique way of experiencing the world. In the 1920s, the Estonian ecological philosopher Jakob von Uexküll introduced the term Umwelt, or surrounding world, or in literal translation, environment, to name each creature's experience of the world as mediated by its particular bodily senses. So we have a bat's Umwelt, an octopus's, a dog's, a human being's, and so on, right through the array of life forms. A large part of a snail's Umwelt is mediated by the slime it produces to aid its mobility. Van Dooren is fascinating on the subject of slime. Characteristically, he chooses an attribute that his Western audience knows well, but has probably not much thought about, and if they have, probably with some distaste. Snail slime. For Van Dooren, this is a key that opens doors on all sides. The slime is not only a way of moving, it is a system of knowing, a sensuous frontier between individual and world. Each trail carries a richness of chemical information that tells the snail and others of the species how to find home and food. It arouses them erotically. It constitutes their language and communal life. This Umwelt stands in revealing contrast to our own. And the contrast, as brilliantly brought out in Van Dooren's description, gives us a glimpse, just a glimpse, of the processes continually making the natural world that surrounds us and makes us. With each extinction, that world is diminished. Thank you, Thom van Dooren, for showing us this with such vividness and accessibility, and for showing us not only what we are losing, but what we may still have time to save.